And Ajahn Chah always talks about the point of knowing, but Thai people, when they talk about the chitta or the knower, they're also talking about the heart. So feeling and knowing is almost the same. They put their Thai culture puts more emphasis on feeling as a way of knowing, whereas the West has this long history of um, you know male-dominated philosophy and science, sort of devaluing feeling as a way of knowing. But in Buddhism, feeling is a way of knowing. There's three different aspects of mind discussed in Buddhism. The chitta is sort of like the feeling mind, and vijnana is sensory consciousness, and then the mano is sort of like the intellectual, cognitive part of the mind. And these are all different forms of mind. But what I was getting at with that is the Dhamma converges on the point of feeling. When the Buddha talks about that, he's talking about the chitta. Okay, so today is the Monday Sangha Hangout on Discord. And we were just starting to talk about the statement from the Buddha that the Dhamma converges at the point of feeling, and feeling as one of the domains of knowing in the framework of the five aggregates. The Buddha talks about, the form aggregate, which is physicality, that which takes up space. Talks about the feeling aggregate, Vedana. So that point of experiencing the world as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. That point of the Sanya Kanda, which is perception or memory. It's translated differently. And then the Sankhara Kanda, which is translated as differently as karma formations, mental formations, volitional formations. Sometimes it's translated as determination. Sometimes it's translated as constructions, but the literal translation, according to Thanissaro Bhikkhu, is co-doings, which is my favorite translation. So I'm going to probably talk a little bit about that today. And then lastly is Vijnana Kanda, which is sensory consciousness. But this point of feeling is really important. In the Thai forest tradition, they call it the Puru, the one who knows, and they're referring to the chitta. We could argue that the Thai forest traditions understand that the chitta is not exactly the same as in the suttas, but I think it is if you listen to enough talks. In the suttas, when the Buddha talks about the chitta, he's talking about the part of the mind that feels, essentially the heart mind, as opposed to the intellectual part of the mind, the mano, the one that sort of rationalizes, thinks, and cognizes. So the reason I brought up the chitta is I was talking about these perceptions of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, the anicca sanya, dukkha sanya, and anatta sanya. And aside from the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination, these three perceptions of anicca, dukkha, anatta are the what is veiled over by avijja, ignorance. So vijja, right knowledge, is knowing the Four Noble Truths, seeing the Four Noble Truths, seeing dependent origination, seeing these three perceptions. They're all interconnected. There's three different ways of speaking about these things: the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, anicca, dukkha, anatta, but they're actually all related to each other. And so where I was going with anicca, dukkha, anatta is that these perceptions, just like everything else in the Dhamma, is aimed at uprooting clinging. The Buddha summarizes dukkha as, birth, aging, illness, and death, pain, grief, sorrow, lamentation, and despair, these five aggregates afflicted by clinging. He talks about the Pancha Kanda, which is just the five aggregates, and he talks about the Pancha Upadana Kanda, which is the five clinging aggregates. And it's the five clinging aggregates that are the summary of suffering. And so everything that the Buddha teaches, the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, the three perceptions, the Noble Eightfold Path, summarized as Sila, Samadhi, Panya, virtue, unification of mind, wisdom, everything is aimed at uprooting clinging, which is fueled by craving. So these things go a lot deeper than we think they do. And the normal way of human life is to avoid the realities of anicca, dukkha, anatta. Normal human life, if we go with traditional Buddhist cosmology, life in every realm of existence, going back endless expansions and contractions of the universe. The way that we live is by avoiding the realities of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-ownership, non-controllability, anatta, the non-self nature of existence. We avoid it by going out. The mind goes out towards the senses, towards the aggregates, and seeks pleasure and avoids pain as a way of avoiding dukkha, anicca, anatta, these realities. And so through this process, we have deep-rooted upadannas within us. There's clingings in the eyes, in the ears, in the nose, in the tongue, in the body, in the mind, and the ideas, in our jobs, in our relationships, in our likes and dislikes, in our autobiographies that we repeat to ourselves in our minds. And when we get close to seeing any of these things as they are, as impermanent, anicca sanya, we experience anxiety or depression. It's a way that the mind avoids looking at it. So I like to tell people who experience anxiety that, you actually have a bit of an advantage in the Dhamma, because there you are right there. The veil is vibrating right in front of you. Just go into it. Look deeply into what is giving rise to anxiety, because that means that you're sort of getting close to seeing something that is afflicted by clinging, which is everything. It goes extremely deep, right? So, as an example I've used before, we're a vision-dominated species, so we have a lot of our sense of self and a lot of our sense of security tied up in vision. Our sense of world is all tied up in vision. And if you've ever sat down and contemplated like a sudden loss of eyesight, if you really, really contemplated what that would be like, you would suddenly, would feel anxiety about that, because we cling to vision, right? We identify with seeing. But the Buddha tells us that all 5 sense doors are empty. He compares them to empty villages. If you look into seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, feeling, thinking, any of these sense doors, you see that there's nothing permanent or substantial at the core. It's just, it's dependently arisen. It's an empty process of nature. And we avoid seeing this. So what I was talking about was these perceptions of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, and how we avoid them. And I was, it kind of was, this thought process was stimulated by this Ajahn Brahm talk I was listening to, where he was talking about anatta sanya, the perception of not self. And he was going in it, and there was like, I found that there was like a feeling of like wanting to vomit in my stomach. Some sense of self connected to my job as a teacher, as a high school teacher, was lingering in there because of some changes I had to make in my life recently. I won't go too much into the personal details. There's our deep sense of self that's autobiographical, that stretches throughout our lives, but there's also multiple senses of selves connected to our jobs and the different roles that we play. And sometimes when something comes to an end, that particular self is exposed, right? And so if in order to sort of make a breakthrough in the Dhamma, we have to drive these perceptions deeper into the things that we hold most dear. And I don't know about you guys, but the thing for me that's always been the most difficult to uproot in terms of lingering self views is the Sankara Kanda. Like I said, the Sankara Kanda is translated often as volitional formations, determinations, whatever. But like Tani Sarabiku says, the etymology of the word actually means co-doing. So ultimately what the Sankara Kanda is what we intuitively and typically think of as the doer within us, the one who's in control, what's called will, volition. Even in the history of Western philosophy, when Descartes went in to look for the self, he settled on thinking as the self. He said, I think, therefore I am. And when Freud talked about different aspects of the mind, he identified the thinking part of the mind as the ego, based off of Descartes' insight. So we've long since identified with discursive thought, thought in general, as the doer within us. We're very deeply, we feel very deeply identified with the doer. But if we follow the Buddha's instructions and we sort of start to reduce our activities in the world, all these different activities, all these different doings we do, these ways of distracting ourselves, watching television, having conversations, whatever it may be, we sort of go into retreat mode and we detox the senses. We allow them to settle and we practice restraint and non-activity. We'll find that the first thing we encounter is boredom or dullness of mind, because the mind is so addicted to stimulation. But if we get past that threshold, we may encounter other things like depression, anxiety. But what's happening is that the activities that the sense of self is founded upon, that's grounded upon, are starting to settle and still, and the self that's dependent on that is also beginning to settle and still. And, entry into jhana has to do, first and foremost, its cause is, we when people talk about jhana, they always talk about the jhana factors of applied and sustained thought, piti, sukha, and ekaggata. So, rapture, satisfaction, and one-directedness of mind. But those aren't the causes for jhana. Those are the signs that the mind has entered jhana. The cause for jhana is expressed in every single sutta where the Buddha talks about jhana. He says, seclusion from sensuality and seclusion from unwholesome states. So it's the five jnandas of applied and sustained thought, piti, sukha, and ekaggata. All of those, he said, born of seclusion from sensuality, born of seclusion from unwholesome states. So what does that mean? That's the important thing, is to understand what that means. Seclusion from sensuality is something that most people have never experienced in their life. I've given the analogy of fish that don't know the nature of water. They don't know that they're wet because they've never been dry, but a frog does, right? Because a frog has spent enough time out of the water to be dry. So when it goes back into the water, it knows what it means to be wet. This is what seclusion from sensuality is. We spent our entire lives intoxicated by sensory experience. And sensuality is not just the activity of the senses, it's the desire and aversion in regard to the senses that makes up what the Buddha talks about when it comes to sensuality. So when we go into seclusion, we go into sensory detox, and we allow it to settle long enough, the mind will, if our virtue is good, if we aren't sort of heedless in our everyday life where we're constantly stimulating the senses, the mind will sort of start to notice, it will withdraw from the senses, essentially. The mind will withdraw from the senses and gather within itself. And then it will withdraw from the hindrances, which is, the hindrances are the five negative emotional states, you can say, that are born of the kilesas, the greed, hatred, and delusion. So, that's sensuality, ill will, restlessness, sloth and torpor, and skeptical doubt. So those things cease. So you're withdrawn from sensuality, and the hindrances have come to cessation. And this right here, this crux, is something that most human beings have never experienced in their life. So it's a radical contrast to what we're normally experiencing in our lives. It's like the first time that the tadpole grew legs and crawled out of the water, except more dramatic than that. And the mind will notice, it will sort of see its own nature of stillness, and it will gather and settle within itself for the first time and become very stable and still. And the body becomes sort of aloof from the mind. And this is the first time you notice that the mind and the body exist in separate domains. And then that's when the jhana factors will arise, this applied and sustained thought, this ability to keep the mind on one single theme. The rapture and happiness, those come from this sense of freedom from sensuality, because it's sort of a prison for the mind. And the ekaggata is that one-directed unification of mind. So this is, you go into first jhana based off of seclusion from sensuality, seclusion from the hindrances, and the mind gathers within itself. And this is what Buddhadasa calls the mind that is fit for work. And it is the foundation of insight in Theravada Buddhism, because the mind that is enraptured, intoxicated by sensuality, and constantly being stabbed and torn apart by the hindrances, our normal state that we feel is normal, even though it's very unpleasant. This is when the three perceptions will clarify, essentially, is what I'm getting at. We don't know how unsatisfying, how painful, how much suffering is involved in our normal way of being until we've completely become secluded from it. It's like, I compare it to like a drug addict going into rehab. Maybe the drug of choice has become part of your identity. Your community of friends all use the same drug of choice. Your narratives that you tell yourself that justify the behavior is all part of your storyline. But for whatever reason, you go into detox, you get through the withdrawals, you go into rehab, and you get to a point where the mind finally becomes sober, and then the pain of withdrawal goes away, and the storylines that kept you addicted to those drugs break down. So that would be the hindrances in that case. And then for the first time in a long time, maybe, or first time in your life, you have a moment of clarity, and you see the anicca, dukkha, anatta nature of that drug use. That's sort of what the mind experiences in jhana. It sees deeply into the everything that has made the mind cling, essentially, is seen as dukkha, right? That's why a lot of times when you look at the suttas, the perception that sekas have, stream enters and beyond, they're called sekas, is whatever is arising is dukkha arising, whatever is ceasing is dukkha ceasing. That's just how they see anything that arises and ceases. Because anything seen to, because they've had the vision of the Dhamma that whatever arises due to a cause is already ceasing, right? Whether it's happiness or sadness, whether it's pleasure or displeasure, whether it's anxiety and depression or rapture and bliss, it's all seen as not worth adhering to. The Buddha, in one sutta, summarizes the whole Dhamma as nothing whatsoever is worth adhering to. Because the Buddha compares, oftentimes the kilesas are compared to fires, but sometimes it's almost discussed almost like a glue, like the defilements are what glue awareness to the khandhas, essentially. And he talks about awareness release, of relinquishing the khandhas, essentially. But the reason that first jhana is so important is because it's sort of like only when the mind has sort of left the realm of sensuality or withdrawn from the realm of sensuality, can it really see to a certain level, to a deep enough level, the impermanent nature of our desire for these things, and these things in and of themselves, and the fact that they're impermanent makes them unsatisfying, and the fact that they're impermanent, unsatisfying makes them completely uncontrollable. And also another thing that's significant in the jhanas, which is kind of what I was been thinking about and sort of circling around at the moment, because it's a difficult thing to talk about, is the mind even becomes withdrawn from that which is usually experienced as the controller of experience. That's what the sankharas are. When we're identified with the sankharas, we feel in control of the body, we feel in control of the mind. But when the mind goes into a certain level of jhana, these sankharas, these co-doings, as Thanissaro Bhikkhu translates them, or at least he says that's their literal translation, are seen in the same way that the body is seen, as being, part of an empty process, essentially, and just an unfolding process of nature. And when this perception is brought deeply, this is where I started. These things, you can talk about them all you want, but actually, when you bring them within yourself, you can feel in your experience where you get like a sense of repulsion in the body, or a sense of anxiety, a sense of depression, a sense of sorrow, a sense of sadness. You can sort of feel out where there's clinging in experience by really, really, really bringing these perceptions deep into experience. We really are afraid to take these perceptions and look deeply. And the things that you actually have to look at are the things that you cherish most. And what most people cherish most, just to skip everything else, is our sense of self, is me. What do you cherish more than me? I've been here since I was born, or so it seems, right? And the sense of me is really just rooted at different points in time, in the body, in the feelings, the perceptions, in the mental formations, the sankharas, in consciousness. So the purpose of the three perceptions is to root out clinging in all of these different areas. And the purpose of sense restraint, and the purpose of, in the way we talk about it here, at least in the way I understand it, of returning to a state of satisfaction, that middle way, where, whether it's a positive state of mind or a negative state of mind that arises, we see it as impermanent, and part of the change that can be made is the change of attitude, not just change in the mental state. At a certain point, you shift the attitude from one that like needs to feel good to one that's okay with allowing things to arise, degrade on their own, and pass on their own, until the mind is happy in that still point in the pendulum, that middle way, at the perception of impermanence, where things are allowed to sort of arise, persist, and pass on their own, and the mind gets to a level where it's not moved by these things. So these are just some things that I've been thinking about recently. But I'll check in with you guys and see if anybody has any thoughts about that, any of that, questions about it.
I guess I've got a question about the change of attitude that you mentioned. Is there any sort of where in the Pali Canon, for instance, that he sort of goes into this idea of the change of attitude? The Buddha obviously.
Yeah, So Dhammarato talks about samma sankappa as right attitude. It's normally translated as right thought, right inclination, and the sutta definition of samma sankappa is non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, and renunciation. So our normal attitude is to, want things that are pleasing, want things we don't have. That's greed. To hate things that are displeasing, to want to get rid of things that we don't like. That's hatred. Delusion is seeing things wrongly and thinking that we're seeing them rightly. So traditionally, seeing things that are impermanent as permanent, seeing things that are unsatisfying as satisfying, seeing things that are that are not me or mine, not controllable or ownable as me and mine, as controllable and ownable. So, and the deepest delusion, of course, is self-view, but that one's always so difficult to talk about. But so right attitude is non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. So instead of a mind that's constantly chasing after what it finds appealing, running away from what it finds as repulsive, and sort of just being confused in general, which is sort of the root of those other behaviors. And that it sees what is, sees reality rightly, what is impermanent, impermanence as impermanence, unsatisfactoriness as unsatisfactoriness, non-self as non-self. And then the renunciation aspect of right attitude go off. The renunciation aspect of right attitude is a reorientation of mind. So our mind is normally directed outward because of greed, hatred, and delusion. And when we're in the early stages of the practice, we understand that we're abandoning things externally. But when you enter the noble stage of practice, when you cross that threshold into the noble Dhamma, which is really where the Eightfold Noble Path begins, you understand renunciation as I know it, as an internal practice. So what we're actually renouncing is craving and clinging and bhava, existence. We're renouncing birth and death, essentially. So we're renouncing wanting things we don't have, trying to get rid of things that we don't like, this way we've been living our lives, renouncing that delusion. We're adopting the three perceptions. And we're renouncing clinging, right? So taking things personally, taking the world personally, seeing myself at the center of experience, everything that's happening to me. We're renouncing that. We're renouncing, it's a shift. Bhante Punyaji calls it a shift from existential thinking to experiential thinking. So, because we don't understand how the process of perception and cognition and affection work, the perceptual aspect of the mind, vijnana, the cognitive aspect of the mind, mano, and the emotional part of the mind, the chitta, we don't understand these three processes properly. So we take the objects that they create as things, essentially. Bhante Punyaji calls this existential thinking. So that's how the sense of self, the sense of the world, and the sense of relationship between self and world is created. Anyway, so that's bhava, essentially. It's a deep seeing into... Bhava is usually translated as becoming, but it's better translated as existence. It works as becoming, but when the Buddha was trying to solve suffering, he came to the conclusion that the idea of existence itself is a wrong view that's created in the mind. Because if you see dependent origination clear enough, then you don't see people, places, and things. You see sort of a continuum of causes and conditions, where there's nothing static or permanent anywhere in it, right? The something that is static or permanent is only a concept in the mind. I've talked about this before as like, the Mississippi River. It sounds like a thing. We say the Mississippi River, but it's only a thing in our mind. It only exists in the mind. It's, as a concept, it's objectified by the mind as the Mississippi River, but really what it is part of a larger context that we call the water cycle, right? The Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico, and I can't remember where its headwaters are. One of the Great Lakes, or whatever. They're also part of the water cycle. The oceans are part of the water cycle. The atmosphere, the clouds, it's all part of the water cycle. That's a continuous ongoing process that's governed by this law of determinism, right? So when you see dependent origination, it uproots any perception of a thing anywhere in experience. What you see instead are causes and conditions giving rise to experiences. And the Buddha narrowed down his focus just to one phenomenon, which is dukkha. So I don't want to get too complicated. So dependent origination is a specific case of determinism. We could look at it broadly at how the universe is governed by this principle, but the Buddha, the broad principle he spoke of is this: with this there is this, with the cessation of this ceases, right? With the arising of this there is this, with the cessation of this ceases. That's his broad articulation of the general principle of determinism that governs life. But he focused that principle on experience, at how dukkha comes into being and how it comes into cessation. So that's what paticca samuppada is, right? And when that is seen clearly, through continuous introspection, through jhana, and then through applying the three perceptions while in jhana, you can't. It uproots any sense of a self, because a self is an entity, right? The Mississippi River is a self. Michael, whatever it may be, anything you give a name to, namarupa, name and form, right? Anything you give a name to is technically a static concept that the mind creates, when reality itself is quite dynamic. So you're trying to uproot this perception within your own experience, within these five domains of experience that the Buddha calls the five khandhas. And so you examine the body through anapanasati. You see that the body is a dynamic process. It's made up of, in the suttas, they talk about hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, and skin. And then they go through the different organs and whatnot. But in our modern understanding, we could talk about the respiratory system, the nervous system, the circulatory system. The body is made up of all these different systems. The limbic system. It's a collection of systems. And then, the mind is also made up of these different systems that condition each other, feeling, thinking, perception. When you examine these different systems, you can't find anything permanent within them. It's actually what Bhante G, I can't remember how you pronounce his whole name. He wrote Mindfulness in Plain English. He's a really great monk. But he translates Sakkaya Ditthi as the view of permanence, essentially, having the idea that there's anything permanent within experience. When you look at experience through the lens of the three perceptions, through dependent origination, through the Four Noble Truths, it uproots your ability to see something permanent within experience, and that lightens the burden of life. Because the thing, and sort of what I was kind of thinking about before this call, and this is probably going to be a more tangential than most of the talks that we've had here, just because this is sort of something I've been circling around. But the thing that we are most attached to as ourselves, more than anything, we talk about putting down the body. In the modern world, it's kind of easy to see that we're not the body, right? Necessarily, that the body belongs to nature, that most of the body is driven by unconscious processes. We still identify with the body, but most people who get into Buddhism have a pretty good idea, of the conditionality of the body, of the impermanence of the body, of the unsatisfactory nature of the body, of the non-self nature of the body. But what's really difficult to uproot is identification with the doer and the knower. This is the sankharas, that's the doer, the aggregate of doing, you could say. It's one way of thinking of it. And then the vijnana is the aggregate of knowing. It's really difficult to uproot the sense of ownership, the sense of controllability within those two aggregates. And, I'm not going to try to go on about uprooting that, but the point I'm making is that the three perceptions of anicca, dukkha, anatta are meant to be internalized to the degree where you kind of find where you're most afraid to apply those perceptions, because that's how you discover clinging. You kind of have to take the cap off of it. You have to kind of look at where you're most, where you grasp the most strongly. You could start with external things like your job, your house, your family. You could say, okay, these things are impermanent. Everything that arises due to a cause is already ceasing. The beginning of the sort of the building of a wave is already the beginning of its ending, right? That's that opening of the Dhamma eye that Anya Konanya expressed. All arising phenomena are already ceasing phenomena is a more accurate translation of that. You see the cessation already in the arising of something. If any of you guys have had children, have any of you guys had kids? Any of you here parents? This wasn't just me. I've talked to other parents, but when your child is born, not for everybody maybe, but your first thought is now they can die. It's sort of the terror of becoming a parent. Once we talk about, so this is just going on a little bit about anicca sanya. We talk about life and death, like those are the opposites, but that's not the opposites. Birth and death are the opposites. Like the actual cause of death is birth, right? Something coming into being is the reason why it ages and dies, right? So you can apply anicca sanya to that, externally in that way to help you release your sense of ownership and your sense of satisfiability over external things. But that's sort of the beginning, right? And then the deeper level of practice is when you start applying the perception of impermanence to everything you hold dear within these 5 domains of experience: the body, the feelings, the memories, the perceptions, discursive thought, verbal, thought, these internal narratives that we live in and as, and sensory consciousness, so that's that reorientation is another way to think of samma sankappa. It's taking right view, which is that first of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is, seeing the Dhamma, seeing dependent origination, seeing the Four Noble Truths, seeing the 3 perceptions, and orienting it inward. That samma sankappa is a reorientation. It's turning that view inward and uprooting the clinging that is hiding at every level of the mind. So anyway, I'll stop that train of thought there, but check in and see if there's any other questions. Sorry if I'm a little more tangential than usual today. Had an interesting week.
I don't
a
have
lot of what you say sounds like. Sorry. Continue. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say a lot of what you were saying sounds like the teachings on emptiness, from Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which I learned that through Robert Bayer, who is a student of Tanasaru Bhikkhu.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a really good book on dependent origination or dependent arising, which I'll put up before. It's called Seeing That Frees.
And who's the author? Yeah. Nagarjuna didn't. His interpretation of dependent origination and his discussions on emptiness, he didn't really, in my opinion, invent that, because all of that is in the early Buddhist texts. Even the analogy of the chariot, the Bhikkhuni Samyutta, are the verses of the ancient nuns. They're these beautiful utterances, poems, by bhikkhunis, female monastics, expressing their liberation. And the bhikkhuni Soma, or Sona, I think it's Soma, her verse, Mara comes to her, and Mara is, in my opinion, equivalent to the snake in the Garden of Eden. The snake convinces Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, basically to destroy paradise by personalizing it. Adam and Eve, they don't know they're naked. They have no sense of self. They're essentially just, they're just unbound, selfless experience. That's what makes Eden a paradise, right? And then they eat of the fruit, and which knowledge of good and evil is judgment, right? And they develop a sense of self. That's why when God comes and he sees them hiding, they say, I'm hiding because I'm naked. He says, how do you know that you're naked? Right? The self view has been born in them. And it was the snake who convinced Eve. Mara plays the same role in the suttas. He's always trying to take, and it's said that even after the Buddha's awakening, whenever we have like difficult days or weeks in our practice, we can't really be hard on ourselves, because it's said that Mara followed the Buddha for 7 full years after his awakening, and eventually gave up after he realized there was no way into his mind. And the Buddha was the Buddha. So Mara's never going to stop following us around. So let's just put it that way. That's all of the ways in which craving knows how to convince us to cling again, to start feeding it again, to start feeling it again. But Mara comes to the Bhikkhuni Sona in this verse, and he says to her, what does he say to her exactly? He says something along the lines of, this creature, referring to her body, is getting old. I can't remember exactly what he says to her, but her response is what I remember. She says, basically, Mara, you must be deluded. What is this creature you're referring to? This is nothing but an assemblage of parts. Just as when an assemblage of parts that were once scattered or brought together are designated by convention as chariot, so these 5 aggregates, when they're brought together, are designated as creature. So I think Nagarjuna stole that. Anyway, that's the analogy that Nagarjuna uses for emptiness. But what's significant there is it points directly to, like what I'm talking about here. And Buddhadasa goes through this as well. He talks about the 9 das, the 9 eyes, and he's using a Thai pun here, because the word da in Pali is a suffix that is like ness, ness, that nominalizes a word, or it like adds emphasis to it. So anicca, dukkha, anatta, sunyata. I can't remember all 9. Dhammatitata, dhammaniyamata, idapachayata, and it ends in atamayata. So what Buddhadasa is talking about here is how when you get to the 13th step of Anapanasati, it's contemplate impermanence, contemplate anicca, right? And that anicca is the gateway to all of the other perceptions. So when you've gone through mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness with breathing, right? While breathing in and breathing out, in the first tetrad, you calm the body, you relax the body, you tranquilize the body conditioner, which is the breath. And you realize in the first tetrad that, just like an air conditioner conditions the air in a room, the breath is the body conditioner, so that the nature of the breath directly conditions the quality of the body. So you bring the body into a very relaxed state in the first tetrad, and you realize that the body is the fundamental conditioner for the body is the breath, right? The body depends on food, it depends on all kinds of things, but fundamentally it depends on the breath, and it's also conditioned by the breath. So that's an insight, but it's also a training. So not only do you realize that the body stands dependent upon the breath, but also that you can use the breath to tranquilize the body. So you tranquilize the body, the body becomes tranquil, it becomes secluded from sensuality, secluded from unwholesome states. That gives rise to first jhana. So piti and sukha become the next two objects in anapanasati because you're in first jhana at that point. And then the insight there is that feeling is the mind conditioner. So piti and sukha condition the mind. The Buddha says a happy mind is easily unified. A unified mind sees things as they are. This is a pattern of conditionality the Buddha talks about constantly. So in the second tetrad of Anapanasati, you use piti and sukha to condition the mind and to tranquilize the mind, to concentrate the mind. And that goes into the third tetrad of the mind or the mental states, where you can use these feelings from the second tetrad to concentrate, unify, liberate the mind, meaning like to have the mind, at least in this moment, relinquish craving and clinging. Or clinging specifically. So then that is what Buddhadasa calls a mind fit for work. So those first three tetrads put the mind into at least the first jhana, where the mind and the body, people don't talk about this a lot, but there's a clear distinction between the mind and body. Their domains completely separate. The body will either feel like a faraway thing or like it's not there at all. And then there's an even further separation of the activities of the mind from the mind. So thinking, thought and perception, feeling, these things also sort of like detach from the mind. And so when sort of the aggregates or whatever framework the Buddha gives, the four foundation, when the distinction between each of the domains is clarified in that way, it's like you're taking the parts of the chariot apart, essentially, right? And then you get into that fourth tetrad, which is the insight tetrad of Anapanasati, the insight and liberation tetrad of Anapanasati. You apply the perception of impermanence, that 13th step, to the practice itself while the mind is in jhana. And you see, the impermanence of the body, of the feelings, of the mental states. And by seeing their impermanence, you see that they cannot be satisfying. So the perception of impermanence leads into the perception of dukkha, a deep perception of dukkha. It's almost like a repulsion, with sensuality, with the body, with ideas, with all of the things that you've been caught up in your whole life. And that leads into the perception of anatta, because you see that there's no controller in there. What you've taken to be the controller is these sankharas, these mental formations, these mental intentions, but what you see is that that they're part of a causal chain, essentially. And the sense of control is sort of a reflexive feeling that's part of that causal chain. But you see that this sense of control and ownership is actually just it reflects all of the khandhas due to craving and clinging. And so that's not there when you're in jhana. So there's already a lack of a sense of ownership in it, but there's a deeper sense of sort of locating that owner, that controller, when the sankhara khandhas are discerned, and you see sort of that they're nested within a causal sort of chain. And so the sense of ownership, then, that anatta sanya is uprooted, or at least seen through, right? While you're in this 13th step of anapanasati. And then that brings about the sunyata sanya. That's what I'm getting at here, is the perception of emptiness. Emptiness is essentially the culmination of, well, it's the culmination of everything, you can say. It's one of the qualities of nibbana, but in the way that Buddhadasa talks about, it follows anicca, dukkha, anatta. So when you see things as impermanent, as unsatisfying, as unownable, as not self, you see them as empty. Not empty emotionally necessarily, but in the analogy I use, where we used to look at a storm and personify it and think that's a god who's angry. Now we look at a storm and we see that's a conditioned arising. It's governed by natural law. That's emptiness. We don't see a self in a storm. Because emptiness in the Pali Suttas takes different forms, but the most frequent is empty of self and what belongs to a self. So there's no mere mind. There's no self. There's no owner or controller in anything. That's what emptiness is. The perception of emptiness is that there's no owner or controller anywhere in nature, essentially. And then Buddhadasa goes further with it. He goes, after you've seen impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self, emptiness, there's this sense that things are just what they are. I think that's the Dhamma Titata. He calls it naturalness. Things are just what they are. They just are what they are. They're just natural. They just go by nature, And then Dhamma Niyamata is like, okay, natural law is actually what's governing all of this, not just externally, but internally. It's so funny because in our society, we know that nature is governed by natural laws, but we have so much trouble understanding that there's no point where we're separate from that, I've used the analogy about how birth is really just a perception, existence is just a concept, right? By looking at the fact that we say mammals are born, humans are born, sheep are born, right? Anything that's a mammal, we say it's born. But birds, we don't say they're born, we say they hatch, right? And what's the difference there? They're both. It's both a process of growth and decay, or whatever, an ongoing dynamic process of nature. But why do we say that mammals are born? It's because when the baby exits the womb, that's a perceived point of separation. So birth conceptually is a perceived point of separation. And that is why when the Dhamma is seen, birth and death are brought to an end, because you don't see a perceived point of separation anywhere, right? It's all part of an intricate causal process, So nothing is seen to be me or mine. No, there's a sutta where a monk, is talking about how he's seen all these perceptions thoroughly, but he still has a sense of subjectivity, essentially. It's not exactly what he says in the suttas, but it basically is what he's talking about, the sense of like experiencing. And the Buddha tells him, or maybe it's Sariputta, it's either the Buddha or Sariputta, he says, you should understand that sense of I am, that sense of subjectivity, belongs to the aggregates in the same way that the scent belongs to the flower. So it's just a quality of the aggregates. It belongs to the knowing aggregate or the sankhara aggregate. So that sense of subjectivity is not what goes when the sense of ownership and the sense of me is uprooted. But anyway, that's sort of beside the point. So I'll just return to Buddhadasa's 9 das, just finish them up real quick. I don't remember all of them right now off the top of my head. He talks about Ita Pachayata. I think it's the second to last one, which is that conditionality, seeing that like deep law of nature as being what's governing everything. But the important thing is that last one, Ata Mayata. And for some reason, only Buddhadasa talks about Ata Mayata. He calls it the last word of Buddhism. And essentially, he translates it as unconcoctability. And I mean, everybody talks about this. I mean, all the advanced monks talk about this as like the real goal of the practice. But Buddhadasa kind of puts it with this word. But anyway, it's when the mind can't be conditioned by anything. And there's almost no way of talking about this without creating the concept of a separate, of like a separate knowing awareness, when that's not necessarily what's intended, because there's, if you've read like Mind Like Fire Unbound by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, or you've experienced deeper jhanas, there is sort of a level of experience where like greed, hatred, and delusion comes to cessation, and awareness is like released from the khandhas, essentially. And Ajahn Dunn calls this, he's a Thai forest monk, he calls this the mind that doesn't depend on consciousness as its cause. Ajahn Chah talks about this as he doesn't have such a esoteric way of talking about it, although he hints at it. But the way the Buddha talks about it when he talks about Nibbana, because Nibbana is one among like 33 words the Buddha actually uses to describe the goal of the practice, and if you look at the other 32 descriptions, it paints a little bit more of a complete picture of what the practice is actually getting at. But in this essay that Thanissaro wrote, Ajahn Jeff wrote, which is actually just a kind of like a curation of suttas with a little bit of commentary in between, he points out that our modern understanding of when the Buddha talks about Nibbana as like the fire going out, our mind immediately goes to like non-experience, essentially, like a blacking out of all experience, because of how we understand fire nowadays, which I would argue against that, but if you sort of understand fire. But he said that in the Buddha's time, fire was understood to sort of have sort of like almost exists as in potential, but only manifest under particular conditions when agitated, essentially. So when the Buddha talks about Nibbana, he talks about the unconditioned, unbinding, the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion, and the uprooting, the destruction of ignorance. There's a sense in that, whether it's there's a sense of sort of unbinding the aggregates, essentially. It's the only way I can say it without making it sound like I'm talking about something separate. So, but anyway, the point I was trying to get at there, actually, before I got a little sidetracked with that Mind Like Fire Unbound thing, was this imperturbability of mind, essentially. When what we call the mind sees clearly, sees properly, it essentially rests within its natural state, is not sort of stirred to attraction or aversion or delusion. And that's what Buddhadasa talks about when he's talking about Atamayata. So, and, this is sort of what the middle way is about. It's about, I call it that, the point in the pendulum where it comes to rest. The way that we are addicted to stimulation, we don't let the pendulum come to rest. We keep pushing it. So it keeps swinging from happiness to sadness, rapture to depression, whatever it may be. Whenever we feel good, we grasp it and we hold on to it and fuel it. And then, of course, that triggers birth, and then there's a decay, and then there's death, and then we go into the unhappiness, and then we just spend our lives swinging back and forth, essentially. And anytime the pendulum gets close to settling in the middle way, we experience boredom, restlessness, anxiety, depression, essentially anything to avoid that natural state of rest, which is the natural state of the mind. If Dhammadasa was here, he would have said that already, probably. And so from the beginning through the middle and to the end of the path, it's really about discerning the middle way. It's hard, sort of, and uncomfortable in the beginning because we're so addicted to the two extremes that the idea of giving up, chasing after what feels good and avoiding what doesn't feel good, and just being okay with things at rest. We're very avoidant of that. But that middle point, which Ajahn Chah, he calls that middle point the perception of anicca, the perception of impermanence. If we just rest in the perception of impermanence, so when happiness arises, instead of chasing after happiness, we just say, oh, a happy mental state has arisen, whatever, when sadness arises, oh, a sad, unhappy mental state has arisen. We know the happiness is impermanent. We know the sadness is impermanent. We know the dullness is impermanent. We know the drowsiness is impermanent. We just continuously return the mind to its own resting place in the knowledge of impermanence. Gradually we cease fueling this whole cycle that the Buddha called samsara. And gradually, everything starts to cool down. And this is what I feel when Dhammarato talks about satisfaction. He's talking about this resting place, this everything is good enough, things are okay exactly as they are, and that sense of well-being gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper as craving and clinging lose fuel. And as a cycle of birth and death stops happening. When you go from a good mood to a bad mood, that's essentially what the Buddha is talking about with birth and death. And whether or not you accept rebirth as a doctrine, let's say, the way that rebirth is understood is that the mind is continuously assuming different positions within the same five aggregates. That's why in the suttas, the Buddha will say at the breakup of the body when he refers to like the normal person's death, but when he refers to the death of an arahant or a Buddha, he talks about the breakup of the aggregates. He doesn't actually refer to the aggregates breaking apart in the case of like a Patujana's death, or even, a Sotapanna or a Sakadagami or whatever. But what you can see, because the Buddha is really the Buddhism is a phenomenological teaching. It's an experience. It's not an existential philosophy. It's an experiential practice. Is that we are assuming a subject position within the aggregates continuously, always. And the idea in rebirth is that just kind of continues after the breakup of the body, that we just assume another point of view within the aggregates, but you don't actually have to take that on as a view in order to understand, rebirth as it's happening here and now. You may be you may wake up in a good mood and then end up in a bad mood and then back in a good mood. That is the mind being born into one state or another continuously throughout the day. So returning to satisfaction, returning to the natural state of the mind, returning to the resting place at the knowledge of impermanence is the way that we interrupt this cycle of rebirth, essentially, because we're tired of it. You're supposed to be sick of it at this point. So that the mind just kind of comes to stillness. It's like you've been shaking the snow globe your whole life, and now you're just going to put it down and allow the debris to settle and everything to become clear so that the mind can sort of see things as they are and stop going outside of itself, chasing after pleasurable things, running away from just unpleasurable things and whatnot. So.
Nice. It reminds me of Ajahn Chah's. He describes it's as if you're sitting in your living room in the only chair in the house, and you have the visitors coming in and going, but you're taking up the only chair. And I really understand what that means now. Now that I've started to sort of get into this notion of satisfaction that I found through Dhammarato, to just like you were saying there, but exactly just sit there in that sense of stillness and peace, and it feels so good. You don't need anything. Yeah.
I mean, dissatisfaction is what makes you get out of the chair.
Yeah.
Once you get out of the chair, then the defilements can come and sit down. Yeah, you said Ajahn Chah.
And to watch out for that as well. Yeah. To I guess to look out for that as well. Like, I guess that's the becoming as well. Like, notice that little inkling, that first little, subtle thought that comes up that says, "Oh, I should do this." That's that. I'm assuming that's what you're sort of pointing to with the doer.
Yeah, I mean, if we were the doer, there's agents in there, there's agency in there, there's will. It's just not ours, If it was us, then, we'd only eat the best food. we'd if we wanted to have we'd have complete control over our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and what the body does. We sort of participate in it. We don't have full control over it, but the way that participation works is that you add sankharas to the sankharas that are there, and that moves it in a different direction. This is why the Buddha says one of the conditions for stream entry is wise friendship. You hang out with wise people, and their wise sankharas make their way into your being, and that changes your thoughts, your words, and your actions, right? Because sankharas are mental, verbal, and bodily. So that's those co-doings, those determinations. Determination is a good word too, because it sort of nods to the law of determinism. That is just another translation, you could say, of paticca samuppada. But
conditioners
sort
also.
Of like conditioners, yeah, it's another good one.
Yeah, you talked about a conditioned existence. These are the conditioners.
Yeah. They're the conditioners, and then Sankata are the conditions. It's like before meeting Dhammarato, nobody ever told you that you can just choose to be satisfied. Right? So him telling you that's a sankhara, it's a verbal sankhara, and now that idea, I mean, there, you can think of it as ideas too. That idea is now in your consciousness, and if you've understood it, then that choice is always available now to be able to return to satisfaction. But if nobody ever told you that you can just choose to be satisfied, you may go your whole life thinking that you have to earn the right to be satisfied, right? That you need to do things to be satisfied. You need to get things to be satisfied. But just that one little idea that you can just choose to be satisfied is a very, very powerful sankara, to just use the language I've been using. Yeah, I mean, I veered off of the way that Dhammarato teaches today, just kind of went into a lot of stuff I've been thinking about this past week. So hopefully it wasn't more confusing for you guys than usual. But that's just kind of what came out, I guess. But anyway, yeah, that's sort of like why there's will, but there's not free will. It's like the mind. I like to think of the mind as like, if you just think of it as like a circle, and it's filled with these various sankharas that we've gathered throughout our life, through words, through images, through seeing other people's behavior. When a new piece of information enters the mind, that's when a new choice is available, essentially. So one thing conditions another, essentially. That's sort of when that's clarified, that's when the non-self nature of that khandha becomes more clear. That it's a collection of intentions, thoughts, ideas, that are interacting with each other in a way and moving in one direction or the other. And when you add, the Dhamma, which one translation of the Dhamma, I think they said, like, I think scholars have come up with like 60 different translations of Dhamma. But Buddhadasa talks about 4, apart from the one main one, which is the Dhamma as the Buddha's teachings, and Bhante Punyaji talks about the Dhamma as thought, and the Buddha Dhamma as the thoughts of the Buddha. So encountering the Buddha Dhamma is like adding the thoughts of the Buddha to your consciousness. So when it really gets in there, it's almost like there's no going back, because it's kind of always working its way around inside of you. It's like you've uploaded a program into your computer. A new program into your computer, and it's leading you back to it.
You got to have a relationship with, like, when you're reading a book, you're with that person, even though they're not around. You're with that person, and you're having a relationship with that person. But you got to keep coming back to it to sort of get their essence sort of rubbing off on you. And then, which is interesting.
That's very good. I really like what you're saying.
How you doing today, Michael?
Thank you for that, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I said a lot of things today. Oh, what's that? There's 2 Michaels here.
Sorry, was someone speaking? I was just saying, thank you. In terms of how Dhammarato teaches, like, how important would you say, like, extra knowledge of, like, the suttas, etc.? Like, how important is that to have?
Well, Dhammarato would wisely say that you need just enough Dhamma. I like that, because I have an addiction to the knowledge, to information. It used to be to all kinds of information. Now it's just Dhamma related information. But he's right. There's 17,500 suttas roughly, and they're all about the exact same thing, and they all are for the same exact purpose. Dukkha nirodha, the uprooting of clinging, essentially, the extinction or the extinguishing of greed, hatred, and delusion. The 3 perceptions, they're there to there to break the mind's addiction to its harmful behaviors. It's self-wounding, I guess you can say. But you can, if you can triangulate, you can get the whole picture from one sutta if you have enough insight. But if one sutta is not enough, then you can put together a few. And also, it's about putting it into practice. Ajahn Chah always talked about theory and practice, and how the experience of practice is never going to match up perfectly with the theory. And if you get too into the suttas, and I've done this to myself, I'm still in recovery from doing this to myself, then they could cause you to constantly question even really, really good results in practice, because you're kind of always worried, oh, was this a wrong view? Or, is this coming from delusion? So, I mean, the suttas can be beneficial or they can be harmful depending on how you use them. But the same thing is true for meditation. Like in the traditional understanding, meditation can turn into sitting around wanting things that you don't have. It can turn into sort of like self-delusion. So I think it's a healthy balance between reading the suttas and seeing how they apply to practice. So, but I think there's a reason why the Buddha said wise friendship is the whole of the holy life, and which is because if you practice alone only, then you can fail to see when you're deluding yourself. Whereas friends are really good for pointing that out, I think. Or just if you find that people are annoying you or irritating you, then you know that your practice is not working. Because I mean that's an easy thing to overcome, like irritation with people and sounds like that. I listened to some people who've been monks for 30 years still talking about being irritated with sounds or other monks, and I'm like, what have you been doing for 30 years? How is that even possible? But I don't know.
Everybody's progressing, even if it takes a whole lifetime.
Yeah, anyway, it's just but I guess everybody has different challenges, different things that are harder to get over. So I guess that's another good thing about wise friendship. I like how Buddhadasa talked about why the reason that wise friendship is the whole of the holy life is because he said one understanding of arahat means without enemies or far from enemies. And so externally, an enemy is somebody you have ill will towards. Internally, the enemies are the kilesas, greed, hatred, and delusion. So, and Dhammarato talks about making friends. He always talks about everything is okay and everyone is a friend, or he used to say that a lot. And I think that's another good summary of the practice. Everything's okay and everyone's a friend. That's a great way to quench greed, hatred, and delusion. Everything's okay is a great way of undermining greed. You don't need anything but what you have. And everyone's a friend is a great way of undermining ill will, because it's a complete freaking stupid waste of time to have ill will towards anybody in the world, because it has zero impact on them. It only hurts you, like it's yeah. So anyway.
Call today, Michael. This has been really splendid. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and get out of here, but please feel free, everyone, to hang out and continue delighting in the Dhamma.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate you too, Alexander. It's good to hear your voice.
Thank you very much for your talk.